Purim, a different celebration than we've ever had, but nonetheless joyous, full of mystery and life, full of cats and children smiling, happy. And now the Megillah has drawn to a close. And that's what I want to think about a little bit today. What happens after Megillat Esther ends? There are two hints in the stories of our ancient rabbis that I know about. One from the Midrash on Vayikra says that while Esther survives as a Jew, she and her children become fully part of King Achashverosh's household. And in a parallel to the Ruth story, but in some ways in reverse, her children and grandchildren are the next Persian kings, including Cyrus II, who allows the restoration of Jewish worship in Jerusalem. Another hint is in the rabbinical explanations of the book of Esther, Esther Rabbah, a 12th century collection of earlier explanations on the book of Esther, which ends with a story which we'll hear now and then a tapestry prayer, which we'll read a bit of in a moment. The story is this. Rabbi Chia the elder and Rabbi Simeon ben Halafta are walking through a valley in the dark. Rabbi Simeon ben Halafta looks up and sees the dawn, imperceptible at first, and then growing in strength. He comments to Rabbi Chia, this is like the people of Israel, who in the time of the prophet Micah sat in darkness, but even in the darkness saw the eternal light of God permeating into the world, the Ner Tamid from the beginning of our Torah portion. And then he continues, in the generations to come, like Mordechai, approached the gate of the king, returned again and again to the gate, and then finally stood before the king and found gladness, joy, light, and honor. Before we go into this story, which I promise we will return to, let's turn to the Megillah itself, which, I'll note, does honor Mordechai's approach to the king, but is primarily the story of the eponymous protagonist of the story, and not of Mordechai. We know the story of the first edict of King Achashverosh very well. The evil decree written by Haman and signed by the king with his signet ring. But we speak and teach less about edict number 2, when Vahafochba, when everything is turned upside down. The Megillah reads, "The king has permitted the Jews of every city to assemble and fight for their lives. If any people or province attacks them, they may be destroyed, massacred, and exterminated, their armed forces together with their women and children, and the Jews may plunder their possessions. And in every province and in every city, when the king's command and decree arrived, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, and many of the people of the land converted to Judaism for fear of the Jews." It's one of my favorite lines of the Megillah. And so, on the 13th day of Adar, when the king's command and decree were to be executed, the very day on which the enemies of the Jews had expected to seize them in their power, the opposite happened, and the Jews seized their enemies in their power. Throughout the provinces of King Achashverosh, the Jews mustered in their cities to attack those who sought their hurt, and no one could withstand them, for the fear of them had fallen upon all the peoples. So the Jews struck at their enemies with the sword, slaying and destroying. They wreaked their will upon their enemies. In the fortress of Shushan, the Jews killed a total of 500 men. And when Ahasuerus asked Esther, "Is it enough?" she replies, "If it please your majesty, let the Jews in Shushan be permitted to act tomorrow as they did today. And also, let Haman's 10 sons be impaled on a stake." We all know the Golden Rule, now famously summarized by Temple Israel of Detroit: do unto others before they do unto you. What do you think happens next? We know what happened in the Jewish community in the following days and following years on the anniversary. Parties and celebrations, giving gifts to the needy and packages of food to friends, and hearing the story and the Megillah. But I can imagine the sorrow spread throughout the rest of the city, the news headlines in the non-Jewish press, the funeral processions. Does the king's peace return so easily? Does anti-Semitism end so easily? It is tempting to go for an easy solution, to look at this and say, yes, there is an easy end, to think that our problems can be wrapped up simply as the Megillah ends, with light and happiness and joy, all with one decree, one moment. To think in our modern day that legislation can solve all ills, that the right temple policy or the word to a loved one can solve the dilemmas and bring about dramatic change. That with a sweep of the arm and with the jab of a needle, with a vaccine, all of the pain that came in the days before can vanish. When asking for advice once from a mentor about how to deal with the overflowing stack of papers gathering on my desk, letters, sticky notes, to-do lists, my mentor said to me, if it ever gets to be too much, just take your arm on one end of your desk and sweep it across, pushing everything into the recycling bin. I have to admit, when I heard those words, my ears pricked up, and I was a bit surprised at the advice. But there's real issues, things I need to deal with. My mentor replied, "Trust me, if anything is important enough, it will find its way back out of the recycling and jump onto your desk." You'll see that's a story about something small, personal responsibilities, personal issues, wrapped into a conversation about something much larger, about anti-Semitism, the role of God hidden in the Megillah in our world. And the two do sometimes come together in our own experience, the personal and the profound, the mundane and the extraordinary. I'm sorry to say, friends, that the Megillah Esther, it is a hopeful, sometimes problematic, and very optimistic fantasy. In the real world, in our lifetimes, and the lifetimes of our parents and grandparents, we have seen the mask of civility removed and neighbors turn against us. We have elated in joy and gladness at the founding of a state, which was meant to be a light unto the nations. And we have seen how conflict breeds conflict, how children who have seen harshness and struggle grow up with hate and fear. Our modern generations have asked firsthand what happens after a great upheaval. I want to bring you now two answers from Jewish theologians. Eugene Borowitz says that we need to deal in the big questions, that our Jewish lives need to be postmodern lives wound up with an idea of God and covenant and responsibility, constantly searching to find ourselves within those questions. One of his respondents, Susan Handelman, recounts in a letter to Eugene Borowitz a conversation she had with a student about the book of Job. Like most interesting books, Job and Esther, Job has a story arc with a problem being introduced, a middle full of troubles and tribulations, and an ending when the problem gets resolved. The section on trials and tribulations in Esther is the plot against our people. In Job, it is a whirlwind of individual pain and lament around an experience of the divine. Handelman comments that her students are usually offended at the end of the book of Job because Job just returns to normal, everyday life. He becomes wealthy, remarries, has great progeny, and dies old and full of days. Students often ask, she says, how can this restoration make up for all that suffering? But she, in this letter to Eugene Borowitz, brings up the voice of one student who said instead, no. No one, who said no, one cannot continue to exist on the level of the voice from the whirlwind. One has to come back into daily life. Remember the voice, be transformed by it, but come back to living day to day in the prosaic rounds of family and life. After the experience, the trouble, it is as if we forget. Some of it stays with us like a dream, but we wake up in the morning and life continues on because we cannot always live in the harshness and the conflict. We need in our stories and often in life resolution and a return to normalcy. But I think there's also a great lesson inside the teaching of Eugene Borowitz, who sees value in attempting to integrate many contradictory truths into our lives, bound up within a framework of Jewish peoplehood and our historic relationship to God, that living isn't moving on from the struggle, but integrating that struggle into our own sense of selves. I want to bring us back to our opening midrash now. Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Simeon ben Halafta walking in that dark valley. When the dawn arrives, imperceptible, but growing and growing. This is like the people of Israel who are walking in darkness, but always sense the light of God. And then in the generations to come, approach the gate of the King again and again before finally standing before the King and finding gladness, joy, light, and honor. Now, when Rabbi Chia reads the word king here, he isn't talking about King Achashverosh, but rather about God. God may be light, but the Jewish people are living in the dark, the gray, the breaking, and the shining. You could look at this story as linear, but rather I see the two intertwining, the darkness and the light, the light which will return tomorrow, integrated into the flow and experience of their lives. Following their story, we see a tapestry prayer tacked on. It reads, "And all thy children shall be taught of the eternal, and great shall be the peace of thy children. Read not banaich, thy children, but bonaich, thy builders. And then there will be peace within my walls, and prosperity within my palaces. See thy children's children, peace be upon Israel. The eternal will give strength unto God's people, and the eternal will bless God's people with peace." What is it that comes after the slaughter and the trouble of Megillat Esther? Do we think that trouble goes away with a stab and a jab? Or that redemption might come slowly, blended together with the pain through Esther's offspring, and eventually to a place of imperfect but beautiful peace. My prayer on this Shabbat is that we don't see peace as simple, but rather as a emerging, flowing dialogue with our world. Shabbat Shalom.